Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon. I hope you're having a great afternoon. I listened to some of the talks, and they were fantastically inspiring. I shall begin by apologizing for not being there with you in person. Entirely my fault, and falling prey of the stereotype of the philosopher, I managed to miss my flight. So I am entirely sorry for missing on the opportunity of being with you today. I'm going to try to share my slide. Can I just ask for someone in the room to give me feedback whether you see the slide?
Everything's okay?
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So we have 45 minutes today, and I wanted to use this time to talk about the ethical implications of the use of artificial intelligence in defense for national defense purposes. This has become a very, shall we say, timely or hot topic in the past few weeks once we hear about the use that Israel has been doing of AI over the past few months. But even this morning when we have heard that Google is been in the midst of a discussion with his own employees about the development of a cloud service for the Israeli government, which might allegedly support defense purposes. So I thought that it was a good chance today to focus a little bit on this topic, which is not covered this far by any of the governance approaches we have for AI in the world, not even in Europe where we have the AI Act, but the AI Act explicitly says in Article 12 that it does not cover the use of AI for national defense. So in the time that I have with you, I'm going to cover just a few points, starting off with the definition of what is AI and what is a digital war, and then look at the three questions which characterize the use of AI, the ethics of AI. Why do we need an ethics of AI? What does an ethics of AI look like? And how does an ethics of AI apply to the specific context, in this case, defense? And by then, if I haven't bored you too much, I'll have 1 or 2 minutes to leave you with a message. So let me begin with what is AI and what are its applications in contemporary war waging. Let me start by saying that we're not going to talk, at least I'm not going to talk about sci-fi. Anything which refers to AI gaining awareness, becoming self-aware, having consciousness, having intention, is not scientifically grounded. It's just a sci-fi myth, which is very good to write and read about on weekend days, but it's not research. So this will not be the focus of this talk. And I make this explicit at the very beginning because, unfortunately, the debate and the research on AI in defense has been for decades now being polluted by these kind of narratives, which are nothing but a distraction from much more severe and serious risks, which we need to identify and mitigate if we're going to use AI for defense purposes. So what is AI specifically? When we think about it from a scientific point of view. Now, AI technologies, as I'm sure you might have heard already today, and you might already know, is not one specific technology. It's more a category of different technologies which go from symbolic and sub-symbolic AI to neural networks, robotics, large language models. We don't have to focus on the meet and greet of specifics technologies, but we have to have a kind of understanding of what are the characteristics of these technologies on which we have to focus when we look at AI from an ethical perspective. So this is a definition that we published in Science a few years ago, where we say that AI is a growing resource of interactive, autonomous, and self-learning agency, which can be used to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence to be executed successfully. There are two parts to this definition, which is important to stress. The second one, let me begin from the last part, is what allows us to avoid any temptation to be distracted by sci-fi narratives. It's not about a technology which is intelligent. It's a technology that works behaving as if it were intelligent. Is exactly the opposite. AI is the divorce, Luciano Floridi would say, of intelligence from agency. It is an agency which is able to perform tasks that you and I would perform using intelligence if we were put up to them. And then the other element, which is the one that underpins the rest of this talk, is that when we look at AI, we look at a technology that provides an interactive, autonomous, self-learning form of agency. We're not talking about tools, we're talking about artificial agents. Now, these characteristics, interactive, autonomy, interactivity, autonomy, self-learning, and agency, are the four seeds of all the potential, the good potential that AI has, and also the risks that we need to identify and mitigate to harness this good potential. Now, what is this talk about then? Well, it's not about specific use, one specific use of AI in defense. It's more about mapping all current and foreseeable uses of these technologies across the scope of defense operations. The focus on AI in defense has been centered for over a decade on autonomous weapon systems. This is because in 2012 the US released an executive order on autonomy, and since then the focus has been on autonomous weapon systems. But what we've seen in the past few years, particularly with the war in Ukraine, is that AI technologies underpin the entire spectrum of operations of a defense force, from intelligence to intelligence analysis to target identifications, as we have seen lately in Israel, to the deployment of kinetic forces. And so it's a much wider spectrum of use. The picture you see in the slide refers to Clear View AI, which is Clear AI, which is a company developing an AI systems for face identification. This is a use which is very problematic when we refer to civilian uses, but it has been quite useful in the context of defense and war waging. For example, in Ukraine, it has been used to identify Russian soldiers that had been captured, wounded, or killed during war, to inform their families about this, trying to break the propaganda of Putin regime. So, what are the uses of AI in defense? This is a taxonomy, a high-level taxonomy, just to give a sense of what we're talking about, to give you a sense of the spectrum of uses. And they go from sustainment to support uses, which refer to the use of AI in support of back-office operations, simple logistics decisions, for example, operational planning, as well as AI for intelligence analysis. You might be all familiar with the expression OSINT, open source intelligence, when we collect huge data from social media. This data cannot be used for intelligence, for the extraction of valuable information, unless there is an AI system which helps with this task. And then we have uses which refer to the adversarial and non-kinetic. In other words, we would refer to this as to cyber warfare, cyber attacks, cyber conflicts. Sorry. And here we refer to the use of AI to support system response. We can create malware with AI these days, but AI can also be used to strategize attacks, and so to develop offensive cyber, which we will see in a moment is something quite common, and also to support the robustness of digital infrastructures. And lastly, we have the uses of AI for adversarial and kinetic uses. Of course, lethal autonomous weapon systems are central to this category, but also the use of AI for tactical decisions, exactly identifying targets, and also to support military personnel in combat, insofar as we can endow personnel with sensors and have AI to understand their physicals, how they are doing, and deciding whom, for example, to send in a combat operation. Now, this use of AI does not happen in a vacuum. It's not something that we started doing out of the blue. It is more the latest step of a long happening, I would say, transformation of the way we wage warfare. Philosopher, military experts, ethicists, we've been debating for quite a while whether the digital would trigger a military revolution, so a conceptual, strongly conceptual, and then political changes in the way we wage war, or a revolution of military affairs, so just a revolution in the way in which defense operations work. I think that this debate is interesting in terms of scholarly debate, but not relevant when we move out of the academic bubble, so I'm not engaging with that. What I'm concerned with is stressing with you today, and more in general, that so far we have, until the war in Ukraine, which I take to be a watershed moment in terms of the digitalization of warfare. Up to the war in Ukraine, we thought that warfare would happen across two domains, a physical domain or a physical space made of physical objects, tangible objects, human agents, and then a cyberspace, which we would consider as of made up of digital agents, digital targets. In the physical space, we expect actions to happen through a use of force, so creating whether it's a medium or a high-level use of force. Whereas in cyberspace, we are used to operations which do not have a kinetic impact, so they do not cause a physical damage, and therefore there is an expectation for a low level of force. What we have learned, particularly with the war in Ukraine, is that warfare these days is actually digital in the sense that it spans across the physical and the cyberspace. It includes human agents and digital agents, physical targets and digital virtual targets, and the level of violence spans across both low and high level of force, and so the level of damage that follows. Now, this use of digital technologies, and particularly AI, which we take to be the most compelling example of this transformation, pose important ethical questions, important ethical challenges. On these slides, I've just listed few. The idea is not to be comprehensive, but to give you a sense. So when we think about the use of AI for sustainment and support uses, we have ethical challenges which go from levels of trust. How much personnel should trust an AI system? We're all familiar with the idea of tech bias, humans accepting acritically the outcomes of a machine. How do we prevent this risk, for example, in the defense domain? Issues concerning the accountability gap, insofar as AI systems do not facilitate the identification of the source of a mistake or an error. And then questions concerning lack of robustness. We'll see this in a moment, but AI technologies are very fragile and vulnerable, lack of transparency, and as well breaches of human rights. When we move to the adversarial and non-kinetic uses, so cyber, the risks that we see there are related to somehow a limited control of AI technologies, which can lead, for example, to escalations of responses, but also risks which have to do with the breaching of the principles of just war theory. This could be, for example, using AI technologies in a preemptive way rather than in a preemptive or preventive way without having clear criteria of what works in cyber, but also issues concerning proportionality. And finally, when considering adversarial and kinetic uses, we have issues concerning the responsibility gap, this here the moral responsibility gap. Then we have issues concerning human dignity, the famous question about whether it is acceptable to delegate the decisions to kill another human being, to machines. And then issues concerning, again, the respect of the principles of just war theory, particularly distinction and necessity. One element to consider here is that these ethical questions, these ethical challenges, do not happen in silos. They are kind of transversal. This means, for example, that when we think about the uses of AI in adversarial and kinetic contexts, so to cause physical damage, we have to consider specific elements like moral responsibility and human dignity, but also questions concerning lack of control, questions concerning escalation, and also questions concerning the levels of trust, the accountability gap, the lack of responsibility, the lack of robustness of AI systems. So the ethics of AI in defense really requires a systemic view and a systemic approach to be able to address all these challenges in a coherent and systematic way. Now, usually I take this slide as a way of justifying the need for an ethics of AI in defense. But lately I've been presenting this work around interdisciplinary audiences made of policymakers, military experts, defense employees. And I've understood that the questions about why do we need an ethics of AI is not so much a question about what for. So, for example, we need an ethics of AI to address these ethical challenges, but it's a question which refers much more strongly to whether we need an ethics of AI at all in a defense domain. Now, this question, whether ethics is something that should be considered when thinking about AI in defense, is posed by two camps, which are actually sitting at the opposite end of the spectrum, as it were. On the one side, you have the pacifists, who condemn the use of an ethics of AI in defense because they consider whatever form of defense, war, as something which is morally unacceptable, and so an ethics of AI in defense might actually end up justifying the defense itself, war waging itself, and so in this way it would be legitimizing something which is in and on itself a form of evil. I do not agree with this view. I believe that there is a right to self-defense, and if there is a right to self-defense, there are instances in which war is justified. And if there are wars which are justified, we need rules to make sure that this war happen in a way that doesn't breaches morality, that doesn't breach the values of our society, at least not too extensively. The other camp is the one that we would, or I would consider related to the political realism. And these are those who argue or claim that an ethics of AI in defense, especially these days in the current geopolitical situation, is quite problematic because it would slow us down, whereas our opponent can actually start using these technologies and without waiting for ethics or guidelines to be produced, without restraining themselves. And so if we focus on ethics now, what we will do is to miss out on the opportunities and lose the potential of these capabilities to determine an advantage on our opponents. I disagree with this view because I disagree with this understanding of ethics as something that slows things down, as something that is there just to pose limits. I take ethics to be a conceptual analysis to identify a strategy for risks and opportunities. And these are important elements to consider: conceptual analysis, risks and opportunities. And I want to take a few minutes to show why and how this is important. This is a lesson that we should have learned from the past 10, 15 years, and so I think it's important that we focus on it for at least a few minutes. Remember the taxonomy I showed you before. If we focus on the uses of AI for non-kinetic, adversarial and non-kinetic, so for cyber, AI plays a central role in this context. Now, cyber and the use of digital technologies in defense, they have prompted not only a technical or technological revolution in terms of changing the way in which we do things, but also a conceptual revolution. They have also changed the way in which we think about fundamental or foundational concepts. Take the idea of war. War can be defined in different ways, but at its core, it's the idea of using coercive behaviors or force to make our opponent do things that otherwise they would not do. So the idea of coercion and war and force, they are connected one to another. And for millennia, we have regulated war by regulating the use of force. Now, if you think about cyber and cyber warfare, these two elements, the coercion and the use of force, are now decoupled. We have coercion happening in cyber, but most likely without the use of force, without kinetic or physical effects. So if this is the case, how do we regulate this new form of war waging? And it's not just that. Changes are also more specific to technical aspects, as it were. Now, this is a fortress, and I use this image to represent a conventional idea of defense. It doesn't happen these days anymore like it used to be in the medieval time, but a fortress is a good example of what defense was supposed to be. It would keep people inside secure and would fence off attacks coming from the outside. Now, these two elements, when it comes to cyber, are not coupled anymore. They are actually separated, because the response to a cyber threat goes two ways. On the one side, we have a cyber security element, which has to do with the engineering of the systems, so that the systems are resilient and robust. And then there is a cyber defense element, which has to do with responding to the attacks, fencing off the attacks. The two things don't go anymore hand in hand. And this is an important element, an important conceptual change to consider, because it gives us an understanding of the strategic nature of cyberspace. I promise we're going to go back to AI and defense, but stick with me. It's an important element to understand why we need an ethics of AI in defense these days. When we think about cyberspace, this is a space which has a particular strategic nature. In cyberspace, non-kinetic cyber attacks are much easier to launch than kinetic cyber attacks, and this is for three reasons. The first one is that attribution is still problematic, less problematic than it was 10 years ago, but still problematic, so you quite likely not to be caught if you're launching an attack. Defense are not going to be super effective. So if you launch an attack, sooner or later you're quite likely to be successful. And so it's convenient more to attack than defend. And launching an attack is not as a cyber attack is not as expensive as to launching a kinetic attack. This makes a cyberspace an offense persistent environment. This is an environment where offending is more convenient than defending, and so defense are constantly poked and provoked by an opponent. And defense is not useless, but is ephemeral, so to speak. And this is the reason why we speak these days of the weaponization of cyberspace, a context where everybody acquires offending capabilities before and more than acquiring defending capabilities. Now, this vicious cycle is quite problematic because it might prompt escalation dynamics, but it's also the reason why these days we see cyber attacks as a form of the most worryingly cyber threat or threats to our societies across the globe. These are two charts coming from the Munich Security Summit that happened a few months ago in Germany. And I'm not sure whether you might be able to read them, but the charts show that in the G7 countries in 2023, the population perceived cyber attack as the second more relevant or worrying threat on a long list. And in the latest survey, the one run in 2023, cyber attacks go higher in the ranking than the one run before, where cyber attacks were reported as the fourth more worryingly threat. And similarly, in the BRICS country, where cyber attacks have gone from being the eighth most worryingly threat for the population of this country to the fourth one. It is because we have learned over the past few years that cyber attacks can be harmful, but also that they are common, they happen every day, and there is no measure or ways to fence them off for good. Now, a key actor to investigate and maintain this dynamic is state actors. They are central to this vicious circle. Countries like the UK, they have established an office, a national cyber force, an office for offensive cyber. Russia has always had very good skills in this area, and they've become, fortunately, very well known over the past decade, particularly the past few years. But so has the US, which has, with the cyber doctrine, the strategy, the so-called strategy of defending forward, so being active in fencing off attacks. Israel is also one of the leading actor in this domain. And NATO, since 2016, has adopted a doctrine that allows NATO members to rely on offensive capabilities in cyber of member states to respond to attacks. So there is a dynamic which keeps growing in this context, and AI plays a crucial role in this dynamic, making this circle spinning much faster. The reason are two. On the one side, we use AI to develop offensive capabilities. We use AI to develop cyber or to develop malware. We use AI to strategize attacks on other systems, but also artificial intelligence is a very vulnerable technology, which we are adopting quite pervasively across several domains, from our mobile phones to the digital infrastructures of our offices and institutions. Attacks of AI have become very sophisticated, and they have represented or made in the past few years a very important shift. You might have heard of attacks which refer to data poisoning or tampering of categorization models, the insertion of backdoors in neural networks, or even prompt injections with the later large language models. All these types of attacks, they have one element in common. They have gone from attacks which we were used until a few years ago, entering into a system to extract data, to apply a ransomware, to block access to services, from that to attacks which now work to acquire control of the system and make the system work in a different way. And this is very important because these attacks are quite easy to run, of course, in comparative terms, but they also mean that they offer a new tactical advantage to our opponent in a scenario like the one I presented before, where attacking is easier and is more likely to be successful. This context, this scenario, creates what I call a stability dilemma, where you can maintain stability only through enforcing adversarial strategies, which might at some point escalate. Here we go back to the missing opportunities that overlooking ethics has created so far. The reason why we have a stability dilemma, one of the reasons we haven't been able to limit the offensive persistent nature of cyberspace is because 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we started focusing on cyber warfare and cyber defense, we thought that we didn't need ethics at all, that we could regulate state behavior in cyberspace by looking at the regulations that we have for conventional warfare. This was the approach underpinning the huge missed opportunities, in my view, of the Tallinn Manual. We basically dodged the ethics bullet by thinking of cyber in terms of kinetic. What happened was that we missed an opportunity. We missed an opportunity to identify risks, to identify opportunities to use cyber to improve defense, but also to foster coordination and accountability. Fast forward 15 years later, these days, we don't have criteria to define proportionality of response, and this might facilitate escalations. We don't have criteria to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate cyber targets. And this means that civilian infrastructures can be targeted as well as non-civilian one, and no punishment might follow from this. Fast forward 15 years later, as we don't have regulations, we don't have shared standard between allies, and so it's very problematic to share capabilities across an alliance just because we haven't regulated these technologies and the use of these technologies in defense so far. So this is why we need an ethics of AI in defense. What does an ethics of AI in defense look like is the second chapter, sorry, the third chapter of this talk. Now, the ethics of AI in defense is not a new area of research. It goes back to Wiener. There is a famous exchange of Wiener and Samuels in science in the 60s, discussing a lot of the topics that we today focus on when we think about AI and ethics. And the ethics of AI in defense builds on this tradition. The broader discipline of AI and ethics of AI has had a new summer, starting with 2012 with the new summer of AI. This is a map published in 2020 by the Berkman Klein Center, and it gives you a sense of how many ethics principles or documents outlining ethics principles were published at the time. A review published in Nature the year before counted 84 such documents. And also the map gives you a sense of what kind of topics are recurring there in this document. So it's privacy, it's accountability, it's human rights, it's transparency. And indeed, these are the key ethical challenges that we consider these days in AI ethics. These go from enabling human wrongdoing, the case of bias, reducing human control insofar as this technology might be not predictable or not transparent, removing human responsibility as far as it's problematic to attribute responsibilities for the actions of the systems, removing human skills. When we delegate tasks to AI, we might also lose the skills to perform those tasks, and this makes it very problematic to also retain control over these technologies. and then reducing or removing self-determination, insofar as we use AI to make decisions in a context or in a society where AI is pervasively adopted, we might risk to lose the ability of making decisions for ourselves. And then there are issues concerning security, which are the lack of control and escalation of responses of systems, but these are less central to the debate. Now, if we look at the efforts made in the defense domain about ethics of AI, we'll see that actors have paid huge attention to the relevant literature. In the past few years, not so many principles as in other domains, but the US, the UK, and NATO have published ethical principles for AI in defense. And you can tell that the principles are consistent with the theme and the problems identified in the literature. They all go from using AI in a responsible way, making sure that it's human-centric, making sure that it's reliable or explainable and traceable. I should pause for a moment here and declare a little conflict of interest. I am an advisor to the Ministry of Defence in the UK, and I was actively involved into the preparation of the ethics principles that the Ministry released a few years ago. Nonetheless, I remain critical of a few aspects of these principles. The first one is the language, because in reading the principles sometimes I find some of those redundant. I mean, NATO mentions that the use of AI needs to be lawful. I don't think you need to stress that in a principle. You would assume that it's lawful because it's NATO using that technology, as well as the US, for example, mentioning that the use of AI is to be governable, as it were possible to conceive a use of AI which is not governable. Now, sometimes this language is a little bit cynical because they were trying to avoid the use of some other words which are more complicated. I take the US to refer to governable AI as to an AI which is under control, and then control is a Pandora vase. But still, sometimes the language is a little bit too vague. But this is not the objection I want to discuss with you today. The two objections I want to focus on refer to two elements of this principle. One is the scope, and the other is the level. So in terms of scope or focus, there is one word. I'm going to show you the slide with the three sets of principles again in a moment. One element which is missing is that when focusing on the ethics of AI in defense, the defense establishment has really looked at the debate on the ethics of AI and really learned the lesson there. And so used the relevant word and referred to problems which the academics working on the ethics of AI have stressed a few times. But that's not sufficient, because an ethics of AI in defense has to focus not just on the ethical problems that AI poses, but on the ethical problems that the use of AI for defense, so for coercive behavior, brings about. And so this is the element that is missing and makes these principles half useful as they could be. If you look at the principles compared together, there is one word which is, or one concept that is missing from these principles, which is just. None of them refers to the need of the use of AI to comply with the principles of just war theory or to the idea of justice in warfare. And this is not something that, let's say, is slipping on the side or being put on the side. It's been stressed and argued for in some of the documents. For example, in the DIB documents, the DIB is the Defense Innovation Board in the US, which underpin the development of those principles. And they say that the use of the word justice was avoided on purpose because the principle in the US document refers to fair use of AI and not to just use of AI, insofar as the principle stems from the DoD mantra that fights should not be fair, as the DoD aims to create the conditions to maintain an unfair advantage over any potential adversaries, thereby increasing the likelihood of deterring conflicts from the outset. The point is that nobody disagrees that a conflict requires some form of advantage over the opponent. But it is true that this advantage has to be acquired in a just way. That means in compliance with the principles of just war theory, and that we have a way of understanding justice in war which has been codified in just war theory and then into the international humanitarian laws which build on these ethical theories. So going back to the slides I showed before, an ethics of AI in defense needs to focus on the just element. We need to understand whether, for example, in cyberspace, the use of AI might be a use which allows for prevention. We need to understand how to assess proportionality. We need to make sure that if we're using AI for kinetic purposes, this happens in strict compliance with the principles of distinction and necessity, which is something that these days, given the level of predictability of these technologies, the lack of control that we have, might not be guaranteed. So, the principles provided so far in the ethics of AI in defense, they are lacking this crucial element. An ethics of AI in defense must otherwise address the challenges of AI for coercion, which within defense, which in a way that is consistent with just war theory. And this requires a little bit of further work. On a conceptual point of view, we need to breach or fill a so-called ontology gap. Just war theory and the principles of just war theory are still valid when it comes to the use of AI in defense, but their application is problematic because just war theory does not foresee artificial agency, does not foresee a world made of virtual objects as well as of physical objects. And so we need to expand this ontology, and we need to develop a theory of value to understand what is ethically acceptable in this new form of warfare, so that just war theory is still applicable to it. And then there is an element which has to do with risk assessment. Risk assessment is the new buzzword these days, mostly because of the AI Act referring to risk of AI technologies. Risk assessment is not something that we can do without considering the risk appetite of a community. And this requires considering our values and how much we are happy to accept trade-off of those values, and so accept risk to this context. So an ethics of AI in defense needs also to look at this element. The other limitation of these principles is their level. Now, this limitation is a limitation that I don't agree with particularly, but is important to mention. The principles have been criticized for being of too high a level, and such a level is being considered perhaps too generic to provide any effective guidance. I think that this criticism is misleading and misinterpret the principles, because the principles are very much like constitutional principles to some extent. They provide foundational guidance, no specific one. In a metaphor, we should say that they provide a compass, a direction of traveling, but not a map. They don't tell us the specific way in which we can arrive at our destination. This is the task of the next wave of ethics of AI, research on ethics of AI, which refers to how to apply principles into specific context. Now, maintaining the metaphor of the map and the compass, drawing maps is a normative act. This is a very famous map in the US, but also in the Anglo-Saxon world, is the so-called Gerrymander map. Is a map designed in 1812 of the Massachusetts states, and they redesigned, so to speak, the electoral district, so to advantage the then Republican Democratic coalition for the Senate election. And it's a good example of how when we develop specific guidelines, we actually do a normative action. There is an action, it's an action which has a lot of normative value. And this is the stage that we are in AI ethics, particularly in AI ethics for defense, because we're moving from AI ethics principles to AI ethics tools, guidelines, you name it. And this step is a step which is strongly ethically, normatively loaded. I'll just give you an example. When we develop, for example, AI auditing tools, we might choose between a qualitative or a quantitative metrics. The choice between one or the other determines the scope of the auditing exercise, and so has normative implication. So these tools, standards, and guidelines that we are developing, they are done without an analysis of the normative impact of the they are developed without the necessary multi-stakeholder involvement, which is crucial because in high-risk domain like a defense one, it is important that the application of the principle is able to balance off different but legitimate interests involved. And they pose risk of what I call ethics devolution. This is when in many cases, the translation of ethics principles into practice is delegated to the so-called responsible research and innovation approach, which is when we ask members of personnel to translate the principles into practices, mostly providing questions, criticizing or prompting critical assessment of a specific situation, without endowing them of the necessary expertise, the necessary representativeness to do so in an appropriate way. So in the next stage, what we need to do and understand is that the translation of ethics principles into tools, into practice, requires a methodology. And in high-risk domain, this methodology needs to be able to meet a few requirements. It needs to be developed by an independent, multi-stakeholder, expertise-led body to achieve what Habermas called moral impartiality. They need to arrive at solutions that all the involved stakeholders will consider morally acceptable after proper dialogue and discussion. There has to be an interpretation of the principles that is reproducible and scrutable, because this allows accountability, but also allows to improve the system that we are, the interpretation of the systems that we are putting together. And it needs to, by means of being reproducible and scrutable, foster accountability. One element that we know is that the ethics principles, very much like constitutional principles, sometimes need to be balanced one with another, for example, because they might be competing, representing competing interests or competing values. One way in which we can enforce accountability is by making clear in our methodology how do we prioritize principles one to another. This is something that constitutional courts, for example, do through what Alexei called the conditional precedence relation. So we really need to work on a process, a procedure, I call it a methodology, that will allow us to standardize the process of translating principles into practices to make sure that we can respect this or meet this requirement and ensure that the guidelines for the use of AI in high-risk domain, like defense, maintain some form of legitimacy and are not just devolved onto part of the personnel who might lack the expertise, might lack the representativeness for doing so. And we're getting close to the end of my time, and so also to my message. And the message is a very simple one. It came to my mind by when reading von Clausewitz's book on war. At some point he said, we say, therefore, war belongs not to the province of arts and sciences, but to the province of social life. And I mean, von Clausewitz was mentioning this because he was nesting warfare into international relations and considering this phenomenon, war waging in this wider perspective. But this sentence made me realize one other element, which is my last plea to convince you that we need an ethics of AI in defense, if the first 44 minutes didn't manage to do so. And it's the idea that there is a relation of mutual influence between society and war. We wage war through our technologies, we wage war according to our principles and values. But it's also true that war is a test bed for those principles and values, because it's the moment where we show how far are we happy to go in negotiating, in balancing, in compromising those values. And this is true for every society, but it's even more true for digital societies, when we are waging a new form of warfare, a digital warfare, which is a compelling evidence of a society which is transforming, is being transformed radically by digital technologies. And so an ethics of AI in defense these days is crucial to make sure that we wage a war which happens in respect of our values, liberal democratic values, human rights, for example. But it's even more important because by doing so these days, we are shaping the use of this technology in defense. And so we are putting there the guardrails so that post-digital societies in which digital technologies will not make the news anymore, they will be acquired and assumed without so much attention, they will still be democratic, pluralistic and just societies. Should we miss the opportunity now, it would be very hard to correct it a few years later on. And I will stop here. I hope that I managed to convey a little bit of the passion and the relevancy of this topic, even if I was giving this talk from remote. But I would like to thank you for your time and attention.